In getting caught up in the world that's got politics, philosophies and ideologies, we can miss some very valuable things. Now, my father Don and I were talking the other day, and he said this statement that rings so true, and it's this: here 1 minute, gone the next. Here 1 minute, gone the next. And it's really describing the temporal nature of life. And we went on and we were talking about a plumber who used to do Dad's building work. And I knew him also, having worked on a number of occasions with him on the same building site. Well, one day when this plumber was actually working for another builder, he was up on a dew-covered, slippery roof. He fell off and was killed. He fell off the roof onto a large pallet of bricks and was killed. Here 1 minute, gone the next. I guess the last thing in his mind was the thought that he wouldn't see the day out. Accepting that what I'm going to say now is anecdotal, I guess if he knew that he would die on that day, what would he do differently in the days leading up to the day of his death? What do you think he would do? What would you do? Probably spend it with the family, I guess. Something like that. Saying things to them that normally you would not have said, perhaps. I guess my point here is that in the blindness of, not knowing our future, we can miss some things that are truly valuable. Now, of course, you cannot live life assuming that you're going to be dead tomorrow. You know, if you did, you'd probably never work another day in your life. But you could live each day differently with the anticipation that every day may be your last. Certainly do that. Now, this may seem an obvious truth to you, but you know as well as I do that we often do not give thought to this possibility. We get caught up in the world. We get caught up with their pursuits, their desires, and often we get lost amongst the values that the world puts forward. We get lost in all of that. There is, therefore, I guess we could say, deception that comes from being influenced in a negative way by the world. Now, the Apostle Paul is saying here to the Corinthian church that in their pursuit of worldly wisdom, that is the things of the world and its values, that they are in fact missing something that is truly valuable. In fact, that valuable thing is sitting right under their noses. It was what they originally believed, but what they are now disregarding because it does not have the worldly appeal that they are desiring. In fact, it is so politically incorrect that they are beginning to distance themselves from it. Of course, we're talking here about the cross of Christ. Not only were they desiring the most politically correct and the most fanciest of philosophies, but their behaviour and values were also starting to follow them in their worldly approach. Now, does this aversion to worldliness have a source? At its root, I think it does have a source, and that source is none other than what we call idolatry. Now, when we think of idolatry, what are we thinking of? Well, usually we might think of a little Buddha mounted on a shrine, or Egyptians worshipping the sun, moon and stars, or perhaps the worship of the Baals and the Asherah in the Old Testament. You may even be thinking of Romans 1 verse 22. There Paul writes to the Romans, professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and of four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Interesting, isn't it, there that Paul has in mind those professing to be wise. The very problem this church has buried itself in, professing to be wise. But idolatry is more than the worship of idols, isn't it? Idolatry could be simply explained by this phrase: putting God second place. That's probably the simplest way of understanding idolatry. Putting God second place. So, for example, if Jesus is not first, then something else is put first. And it doesn't matter whether the Lord is then second, third, fifth, or even 10th. If he is not first, then he has been dethroned in the person's life. You see, this is the essence of idolatry. The first one of the 10 Commandments: you shall have no other gods before me. Having other gods obviously puts a competition then between the Lord and other gods. But of course, to be clear, that first commandment is actually saying that you shall have no other gods before my face, or have no other gods in my sight. That's really what it's saying there. So we should see this as saying that you should have no other gods, period. That's what God is saying. It does not say that you can still have your other gods so long as the God comes first. No, it's not saying that. No other gods, period. But the Apostle Paul puts materialism and worldly sinful behaviour squarely in the category of idolatry. So you can go to Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 5, and Paul says, "For this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has an inheritance, a kingdom of Christ and of God." Or Colossians 3 verse 5, "Therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire and greed, which amounts to idolatry." So it seems that idolatry also includes making yourself into a god. You see? Doing your own thing, following your own pleasures to the detriment of God's calling and will is idolatry. And when a man or woman enthrones self, they dethrone God. Isaiah 29 verse 15, "Woe to those who deeply hide their plans from the Lord, and whose deeds are done in a dark place, and they say, 'Who sees us?' or 'Who knows us?' You turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay, that what is made would say to his maker, 'He did not make me,' or what is formed say to him who formed it, 'He has no understanding.'" So God there, speaking through the prophet Isaiah, is pronouncing judgment on the wisdom of an idolatrous world. When a person comes face to face with a crucified Jesus, the world and its form of wisdom will react with intense disdain. It will say that glory is not found in a cross. It will say that power is not found in a cross. It will say that success is not found in a cross. You see, the wisdom of the world says that the cross spells out defeat, failure, misery, suffering. And to say that this is God's way, utter nonsense. To the world, it is utter madness to proclaim that the person of Jesus, God's Son, died on a cross for our sins. Utter nonsense. We are talking here about worldly wisdom, not about wisdom per se. Of course, we have the Psalms, don't we? The Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. They're wisdom books in the Bible. That is wisdom that acknowledges the true and living God and gives sound guidance for living life to the full in light of the one creator God of all. The Psalms says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God, is not really speaking about the atheists there, because there were none in that time. The fool says in his heart, there is no God, is about the one who would say, there is no one God, only many. You see? Funnily enough, Christians were called atheists in the early centuries of the church because we refused to believe in all the Roman gods. We would only believe in Jesus. Let's look now at crucifixion. What did the ancient world think of crucifixion? Did you know that crosses never existed on churches for at least 300 years after the time of Christ? No one would have proudly worn a cross on a bracelet or a necklace. How come? The apostle says in verse 23 that the message of a crucified Messiah is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness, or as one scholar has said, madness to Gentiles. Every fibre of their being considered the message of a crucified Son of God a form of insanity. To speak in that way was literally insanity. So let's work through this. He says it's a stumbling block to the Jews. The Jewish people were steeped in the Old Testament, and they knew that the Old Testament banned human sacrifice. It banned it. It associated human sacrifice with pagan religions. They used to do that. You may recall Ahaz, the king of Judah, who was an idolater, went after pagan gods. He sacrificed his sons to the so-called god Molech in order to try to avert disaster for Jerusalem getting overthrown by the Assyrians, you see. So he chased after other gods. He sacrificed his sons to try and cause the other gods to act on his behalf. And it was banned. So to proclaim in Jesus a human sacrifice to the Jews, that was a stumbling block. They tripped over that thought. They fell into sin and unbelief. They refused to believe in Jesus because of that. The Jews were also aware of the scripture that speaks of the one put on a tree. So capital punishment takes place and the person is put up on a tree to put the fear into people about what will happen to them if they go against the law. So they were very much aware of the person up on a tree. It was a sign of God's curse upon them. And so here you have Jesus put up on a tree. Cross was made of wood from a tree, same thing. So here's this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 21. If a man has committed a sin worthy of death and he is put to death, and you have him hung on a tree, his corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is accursed of God, so that you will not defile your land which the Lord gives, or the Lord your God gives as an inheritance. So to the Jew, Jesus is accursed of God. He is hung on a tree. So how in the world can you proclaim him as Messiah, the Son of the living God? That really is a stumbling block. So from the Jewish standpoint, you know, a crucified Messiah is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. Justin Martyr was a Christian, and he was trying to convince Rabbi Tropho, the Jew, that Jesus is the Messiah. And Justin pointed him to Daniel chapter 7, which speaks of the kingdom given to the Messiah by the Ancient of Days. Here in Daniel chapter 7. I kept looking at night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory and a kingdom, and all peoples, nations and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So Justin pointed this out to the rabbi, and the rabbi responds. This is what he says. Sir, these and such like passages of Scripture compel us to await one who is great and glorious, and takes the everlasting kingdom from the Ancient of Days as Son of Man. But this, your so-called Christ, is without honour and glory, so that he has even fallen into the uttermost curse that is in the law of God, for he was crucified. See? Yet I think the rabbi and the Jews seem to miss Isaiah's message. You know Isaiah's message here? Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves considered him stricken, smitten by God, or even accursed of God. We thought that. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. And of course, is it any wonder after we see the images of Christ in Revelation that we see him as the afflicted one? Look in the book of Revelation, chapter 5. One of the elders said to me, John, the apostle, stop weeping. Behold, the Lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has overcome, so he can open the book and the seven seals. A lion is a predator, isn't he? He is great and mighty. He conquers. The lion is the king of the jungle. But then John looked. He says there in verse 6, and I saw between the throne with the four living creatures and the elders a lamb standing as if slain. That's amazing, isn't it? Here, really, we're seeing the Messiah who conquers not through force and conquest, but through suffering and death. That's how the Messiah has conquered. So we go to the Gentiles. What did they think of crucifixion? Well, as you know, crucifixion was no walk in the park. In Roman times, it was not only the rule to nail the condemned man by both hands and feet, but it was also preceded by flogging. This meant that the blood would flow in streams. Jesus was so weakened by the loss of blood after his flogging that we can see that he was unable to even carry the crossbeam to the place of his execution. It is not surprising that he died on the cross that very day, the very day he was nailed to it. And of course, sometimes depending on the severity of the flogging, the condemned man may still live for days on end after being put on a cross. Crucifixion was inflicted and predominantly put upon the lower classes, slaves, violent criminals, murderers, those guilty of treasonous conduct against the state. So to speak of a crucified man or even be associated with God was kind of like to speak stupidity. It was folly, it was madness to associate God with this kind of thing. And of course, crucifixion was also meant to invoke fear. It was a deterrent against breaking Roman law. The Romans were admired for the way that they had brought peace throughout the empire. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. They brought it throughout all the empire. Highwaymen, robbers that is, bandits, were under control, as were the pirates in the Caribbean Sea. And people praised Rome for bringing peace throughout the empire. And so they had crucifixion carried out publicly. It sent a clear message to everyone. The cross was a sign of a strict and merciless regime. And usually, crucifixion was carried out where the crime was carried out. They would try to do that. It was done that way to sort of give comfort to the grieving relatives whose loved ones were perhaps murdered or killed by the one being crucified. I wouldn't suggest that you think that crucifixion was some kind of justice, because it was cruelty personified. You could hardly say that, well, this was actually justice for what someone does. Cruelty personified it was. At certain times, they would go so far as to even taking the wives and children of those crucified and killing them before their eyes as they hung there on the cross. Now, this was done in previous times to the Romans, but that's what was associated with crucifixion. Quintilian, about 95 AD, he would set up crosses on the busiest of roads, and this is what he says. Whenever we crucify the guilty, the most crowded roads are chosen, where the most people can see and be moved by this fear. For penalties relate not so much to retribution as to their exemplary effect and what it will show everybody. The public display of a naked victim, and they were naked. You know, when we see images, they have a little loincloth on. No, they were naked. There at the busy place, near a theatre or near a crossroad, on the high ground. They would put them there where the crime was committed as well. But it made sure you felt the full weight of humiliation in front of everyone. Because Cicero, he's a Roman statesman, he's an orator. He was killed actually in 43 BC, but he wrote this about crucifixion. Now he says this, he says, how grievous a thing it is to be disgraced by a public court. How grievous to suffer a fine. How grievous to suffer banishment. And yet, in the midst of any such disaster, we still retained some degree of liberty. Even if we are threatened with death, we may die free men. But the executioner, the veiling of the head, and the very word cross should be far removed, not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes, and his ears. For it is not only the actual occurrence of these things, or the endurance of them, but liability to them. The expectation, indeed the very mention of them, that is unworthy of a Roman citizen and a free man. Wow. You wouldn't even mention it in polite society. See, the cross is so abhorrent to a Roman citizen that it shouldn't even be mentioned, talked about. Perhaps he was suggesting that the cross falls into the category of a, Australian C-16 bill. You know, the one where government compels you to not use words that offend or insult. This is what the cross did to the free man and Roman citizen. Polite society would have none of it, not even to talk about it. And Martin Hengel, a commentator, writes, he says this, to proclaim a crucified Jew from some backwater of the empire as a divine being sent on earth, God's Son, Lord of all, and the coming judge of the world, must have been thought by any educated man to be utter madness and presumptuous. The horror of crucifixion was further exacerbated by the fact that the condemned man was never buried. He would be left up there on the cross to die and to be eaten by the birds of prey and wild animals. Vultures would come down, dispose of the corpses. They would take pieces away for their young. And by doing this, they made their humiliation and their dishonour complete. Of course, when Jesus died, they took down the men, all the men from the cross, and it was a concession to the Jews who saw leaving them up there overnight to be in disobedience of Deuteronomy 21, where the exposed corpse defiles the land. So the Romans did this as a concession to them. So they, to compensate, would break the legs of the crucified men so that they could no longer breathe, as they had to push their bodies up to inhale air and then slump down again. And they had to do this constantly to be able to get their breaths. Breaking their legs meant they couldn't push up anymore. And so they sort of suffocated. And they never broke Jesus' legs because they had seen that he had already died. In the ancient world in which Christianity began, they would never understand the singing of the old rugged cross, the hymn we sing. They could never understand that. Of course, they would agree with the sentiments of the emblem of suffering and shame, the old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. They would sort of say, yes, we'd go along with that. But they would never agree with the sentiment that the old rugged cross has a wondrous attraction for me. They would never agree with that. On the contrary, the word of the cross is abhorrent to civilized society. The preacher of such message must be a fool, or worse, he's mad. In 150 AD, Justin Martyr, the Christian apologist, he says this: "They say that our madness consists in the fact that we put a crucified man in second place after the unchangeable and eternal God, the creator of the world." Preaching the cross of Christ brought the contempt of the world down upon the preacher, the one who spoke that message. The cross bore a stigma. It spoke an entirely different message to that of the one all-powerful God, the creator of the universe, that people could conceive of. As one writer says, the cross does not part the sea for people to cross in safety and then drown the pursuing enemy. Instead, it splits the temple veil, and only those who see with faith can see the defeat of the enemy. The cross turns the values of this world upside down. Jesus' death on the cross has turned shame into glory and glory into shame. The foolish message of the cross is what outsmarts the wise, and its weakness overpowers the strong. It's the very vehicle that God has used to convey his judgment on a truth-rejecting world. A world that only sees what it wants to see. A world that has elevated its own wisdom and in the process has tried to domesticate God, bring him down to do its own bidding. You know, in the Beatitudes, we see their worldly values also turned upside down. Jesus calls blessed, doesn't he? He calls blessed the poor, the meek, the mourning, the hungry, the persecuted. What does the world call blessed? It calls blessed the rich, the exalted, those who laugh, those who feast, those who domineer and conquer. That's what the world calls blessed. You see, it's the same worldly wisdom that elevates human pride, which has caused the quarrelling that's going on there in the Corinthian church. They have absorbed the world with its ideas and ideals. They are avoiding the cross because the message is not palatable nor appreciated in the world. So they are casting it off. Now, really, we're not that much better today either. Many churches seem to continue to repeat this Corinthian experiment with disaster, chasing after the world, imitating it to look cool and look acceptable by the world's standards of wisdom. Yet the apostle wants the church to emulate the values exhibited in the cross. Instead of avoiding the scandal of the cross, the church is to embrace it. The cross, which is a symbol of Roman terror and political domination, God turns into a symbol of his love and power. As one writer says, it shows that the power of God's love is greater than the human love of power. Well, our response to this message is simple. The cross is the very wisdom and power of God. If you water it down, if you water its offence down, you minimise its folly You remove its power to save. The answer is unashamedly and graciously, just tell it as it is. Tell the ugly truth, the offensive truth as it is. Say what God has done in sending Jesus to the cross, to die, to be a sacrifice for the sins of the world. For all who believe in him, for all he calls, they will receive forgiveness of sins and they will be reconciled back to him. You see, the cross of Christ is actually a judgment on humanity. It's God's judgment on a humanity that has rejected him. And it divides the world, really, between those who believe and are on God's side from those who see it as folly and reject it. Let's finish here with what Paul says in verse 21. For since in the wisdom of God, the world, through its wisdom, did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the folly, the madness, the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. So to be faithful to God, we stick with the offence of the cross. It's God's power because God intervenes and brings those whom he has called to himself through that message which offends.